The guitar was already in Chuck Berry's hands when Jimi walked into the room. That detail matters, because everything that happened next was shaped by who was holding what and who was watching from where. It was the spring of 1968. London was still the center of the rock and roll world, though it wouldn't be for much longer. The Marquee Club on Wardour Street was hosting a private industry gathering. Not a concert, not a proper show, just one of those backroom affairs that the music press never covered, but that everyone who mattered seemed to find their way to. The promoters, the producers, the session men, the faces, the kind of room where reputations were made and unmade before anyone even picked up an instrument. Low ceilings, bare brick walls, and the permanent smell of cigarettes in old wood. Chuck Berry had arrived from the States 2 days earlier. He was 41 years old. He had invented something. Not perfected it, not refined it. Invented it. The double-string runs, the duck walk, the riff that underpinned half of rock and roll's DNA, all of it had come from him. Every British guitarist who'd plugged in during the 60s had learned from his records. The Stones, the Beatles, the Yardbirds, the Animals, all of them. Every single one. They had put the needle on his records and tried to figure out how his fingers moved. He was the source, the original signal from which everything else was derived. He knew this. He carried it the way a man carries a deed to land, quietly but with total certainty. When someone mentioned Jimi Hendrix's name in Berry's presence earlier that evening, the response had been measured, unhurried. "I've heard about him," Berry said. "They say he puts on a show." A show, not a performance, not musicianship, a show. The distinction was clear to everyone who heard it, and Berry intended it to be. Jimi was already there when Berry arrived, sitting near the back of the room with a glass of something he wasn't really drinking, watching the room the way he always watched rooms, like he was reading the weather. He'd been in London for 2 years by then. Our You Experienced had come out the previous year and changed what people thought a guitar could say. Purple Haze, The Wind Cries Mary, Foxy Lady, songs that had no real precedent, that seemed to have arrived fully formed from somewhere nobody could quite locate on a map. He was 25 years old and he still introduced himself to people by offering his hand first. When Berry entered, Jimi noticed. Hard not to. Berry moved through spaces like he owned them, which in a certain historical sense, he did. Someone made introductions. The two men shook hands. Berry looked at Jimi with a polite, measuring look of a man who has already formed his opinion and is simply waiting for events to confirm it. "I hear you've been playing some of my songs," Berry said. Not a question, not quite an accusation. Something in between. Jimi nodded once. "Johnny B. Good, Roll Over Beethoven. Learned them when I was 15. You were the reason I wanted to play electric." Berry received this without any visible reaction. "Uh-huh." He glanced at the Stratocaster leaning against the wall behind Jimi. White, battered, the strap adjusted to hang low in the way Jimi wore it. "You play that thing with your teeth, they tell me." "Sometimes." "My songs?" There was a pause. Not long, not dramatic, just long enough for both men to understand what was being said. Berry was drawing a line between origination and imitation, between the source and everything that came after. "Sometimes," Jimi said again, his voice the same quiet register. Berry almost smiled. "Takes more than teeth to play guitar, son." The conversation drifted, as conversations do. Other people pulled Berry away. Someone brought drinks. The room continued its low hum of industry talk and musician mythology. Jimi stayed where he was. He refilled his glass once. Part of him was still sitting with what had just been said, not wounded by it, just holding it, the way you hold something you haven't decided what to do with yet. An hour passed, maybe a little more. At some point, the guitars came out. They always did at gatherings like this. Berry played first, which was natural, because Berry always played first. He moved through a few numbers with the easy authority of a man who has played the same songs 10,000 times and knows exactly where every note lives. The room gathered. People applauded warmly, but without surprise. Berry finished and stepped back. Then, almost as an afterthought, he gestured toward the Stratocaster in Jimi's corner with a brief motion of his chin. An invitation, or possibly a test. The difference was hard to read in the gesture itself. Jimmy stood up. He picked up the guitar, slung the strap over his shoulder, and began tuning. The process took less than a minute. His ear was that precise. The room was still mid-conversation, still mid-drink. Not everyone was watching. Not yet. He didn't announce what he was going to play. He never did. The first chord was Chuck Berry's. Not a cover, not a tribute. Something stranger and more deliberate than either. Jimmy took the opening sequence of Johnny B. Goode. That riff that had opened the door for every guitar-based band in the Western world, and played it exactly, note for note, string for string, with the original tempo and the original feel. A few people in the room smiled with recognition. Someone near the back started nodding along. For about 8 seconds, it sounded like a faithful reproduction, like a very good student playing back what he'd learned. Then it didn't. Jimmy's left hand shifted, not dramatically, not with any visible announcement of intent. His fingers simply found a different path through the same changes, and the song opened up in a direction that had no name yet, because nobody had gone there before. He kept the core, the bone structure Berry had built, but everything on top of that structure was entirely new. He bent strings in places the original had never bent. He pulled overtones from chord positions that seemed to exist between the notes, in the spaces where theory said nothing should be. He played rhythm and lead simultaneously, his thumb holding the bass end, while his fingers worked something melodic and almost orchestral above it. A conversation that made the instrument sound like two guitars played by one pair of hands. He didn't play loudly. That was the thing nobody in the room would remember first, but it was the most important thing. This wasn't the Marshall stack Jimmy that the newspapers wrote about. He played at mid-volume, controlled, deliberate. Every note chosen, every bend measured precisely against the space it needed to fill. The room came to a stop, not all at once. It was more like a tide going out, conversation ending in sections, table by table, glass pausing halfway to mouth, a gradual coalescence of attention that became, after about 90 seconds, complete silence. The people near the bar stopped mid-sentence. A photographer loading film set the camera down. Chuck Berry stood near the side of the room. He had a glass in his hand. At some point during those 4 minutes, he stopped drinking from it. His face was doing something that the people close enough to see it would later describe in different ways. One musician said Berry looked like a man watching someone drive his car better than he'd ever driven it. Something between admiration and the private grief of watching something you built become something you no longer fully own. A producer nearby said it was simpler. Berry looked like he was listening. Really listening. The way he hadn't needed to listen to music in years, because music had become mostly a job, and you stopped really hearing your job at some point. Jimmy played for about 4 minutes. He didn't look at Berry. His eyes moved the way they always moved when he played, slightly inward, tracking something interior, a rapid sequence of decisions happening faster than anyone watching could consciously follow. When he stopped cleanly. No flourish, just an ending, placed exactly where an ending belonged. The silence that followed lasted longer than it should have. Then someone started applauding, and the sound built slowly. The kind that happens when people are still partly inside what they just witnessed. Not wild. This was an industry crowd, British, restrained. But the appreciation was real and unmistakable, and something else was mixed into it that was harder to name. Jimmy unslung the guitar. He turned to set it back against the wall. Chuck Berry hadn't moved. He was still standing in the same spot, still holding the same glass, though it had been empty for the last 2 minutes. He was looking at Jimmy with an expression that had no obvious name. Not anger, not admiration exactly. Something in the space between that didn't resolve into either. The look of a man recalculating, quietly and rapidly, something he had thought was settled. Jimmy walked over. He stopped a few feet away. "That's your song," Jimmy said simply. "I just wanted to show you where else it goes." Berry said nothing for a moment. The room had returned to its ambient noise, but the two men were standing in a pocket of quiet. "Where did you find that?" Berry asked. His voice was quieter than it had been all evening. "It was always in there," Jimmy said. "You built the room. I just walked around in it." Berry looked at him for a long moment. Not the measuring glance from earlier. Something slower, more open. Then he nodded. A small, compressed movement. The kind of nod that costs something to make. That requires setting aside something you've been carrying without quite realizing it. He turned and walked away without another word. That was the whole conversation. No apology, no grand acknowledgement. Just a nod. But the people who saw it said that nod contained everything it would have taken anyone else 10 minutes to say out loud. Jimmy didn't release a live recording of Johnny B. Good until 1969, captured at the Los Angeles Forum. It runs over 6 minutes. It begins exactly as Barry wrote it, precise, faithful. And then it goes somewhere Barry had never taken it, through changes and textures that are unmistakably Hendrix, the original architecture still visible underneath, the way a building's bones stay visible in the walls built around them. When the recording circulated, Chuck Berry heard it. He was in his early 50s by then, still touring, still commanding rooms with the same authority. A journalist found him in a backstage corridor somewhere in the Midwest and asked about the Hendrix version, asked whether it bothered him, hearing someone do something so different with something he had built. Barry was quiet for a moment. "Doesn't bother me," he said. "What Jimmy did with that song, I couldn't have done that. Not because I don't have the technique, because I didn't hear it. It was in the song the whole time, and I never heard it." He paused. "That's the thing about something you made," Barry said. "Sometimes someone else has to show you what it actually is." The journalist asked whether he had told Hendrix that. Barry looked toward the window. "I nodded at him once," he said. "He understood." Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970. He was 27 years old. Chuck Berry played for another 4 decades. He recorded his last studio album at 90, released the year he died, 2017. In the later interviews, in the ones about legacy and influence and what it meant to have started something, he would sometimes mention Hendrix unprompted. Not often. But when he did, he framed it the way he framed most things, as information, a fact he had learned at some cost to his prior certainty. "I thought what I built had walls," he said once near the end. "Jimmy showed me it didn't." No elaboration, no sentiment attached. Just a man at the end of a long life saying plainly what it had cost him something to understand. The guitar was his. The song was his. The room in every sense that mattered had been his. And Jimi Hendrix walked into it with nothing but his hands and his ears. And whatever it was he heard inside music that other people didn't quite hear. And showed him rooms he hadn't built yet. Rooms Barry hadn't known were there. By the end, Barry had stopped trying to decide whether to be grateful or unsettled by that. Both were true. Both were right. And the music that existed because of that night in London, because 2 men stood in the same room, and one of them refused to stay inside the walls the other had built, that music belonged to neither of them. It belonged to anyone who ever heard it.